Hey, Soul Stories fam. We're starting a new love journey. Tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and join our family. Now stay with us. The story begins. The night wind swept endlessly across the federal highway, carrying the dry cold typical of the American West, and Penelope O'Hara, 26, exhausted, worn out, yet trying to pretend she was fine, sat curled behind the wheel of the old Subaru that had been groaning ever since she left New York, as if the car itself was drained by her awful year, losing the job she once dreamed of building a life in, breaking up with a relationship that left nothing but the shadow of empty promises, giving up the tiny apartment where she had tucked lavender into every corner for 2 summers, and spending the last of her savings just to escape the city that suffocated her until she no longer recognized herself. When the car broke down on the highway leading into Colorado, the red warning light blinking like it was mocking her last ounce of patience, Penelope slowly pushed the door open, her shoes covered in road dust, long brown hair blown into a mess by the wind, lips dry from exhaustion. And yet in those dark brown eyes something stubborn remained, a bit of hope, or maybe just the survival instinct of someone who grew up through harsh winters on a small horse ranch in Pennsylvania, where she learned to get up no matter how many times she fell. She dragged her luggage into a roadside diner, the classic American kind with a flickering neon open 24 hours sign, a long stainless steel counter, and the faint scent of watered-down coffee and warm apple pie, and sat on a worn vinyl seat with that slightly sticky feel, familiar to places that had witnessed countless exhausted travelers before her. While waiting for her bowl of hot soup, she looked up at the bulletin board on the wall, filled with all kinds of service ads, from roof repairs to lost dogs, and in the lower corner, a small plain white slip of paper caught her eye. Night shift, Whitetail Ranch, on-site housing provided. Penelope froze for a few seconds, not because of the paper, but because of the memories of hay, the sound of hooves striking concrete, the warmth of a horse's breath on foggy mornings, things that had vanished from her life ever since her family ranch was sold after everything fell apart. Her hand trembled slightly as she texted the number on the paper, not daring to hope, simply thinking, worst case, it's a scam. But if I'm lucky, the reply came almost instantly, short, abrupt, but strangely enough, it made her heartbeat skip. Meet me at Red Lantern Bar. Midnight. J. Silver. Penelope blinked. Midnight? Who interviews someone at midnight? And at a bar? Maybe it was a sign of how desperate she was, because instead of refusing, she packed her bag and stood up. Outside, the Red Lantern Bar glowed like a streak of red in the Colorado night. Warm, hazy, strangely familiar to people who had lost their way. Soft music drifted out as she pushed open the door. Rustic guitar chords, a low male voice singing about long winters and Western resilience. Penelope took a deep breath, adjusted her faded denim jacket, then looked up. And she saw him, Jackson Silver, sitting alone at the last table under the soft yellow light. Cowboy hat placed beside him, a dark brown jacket draped over his shoulders, black hair tousled by the wind, sharp jaw softened by faint stubble. He looked like a man who had endured far too many sleepless nights. But it was his eyes that rooted her to the spot, steel blue, cold but not hard, tired, restrained, as if he had been fighting the dark for too long. When he lifted his gaze to her, a slow, assessing look, as though he no longer believed anything good could truly happen, something very small, very real slipped between them. Not a spark, not desire, recognition. As if this soul understood exactly how the other had broken. Penelope walked toward his table, her hands slightly trembling, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. Jackson frowned lightly, but the corner of his mouth softened just a bit before he spoke, his voice low and rough, like someone who hadn't slept well in years. Penelope O'Hara? She nodded. He looked at her long enough to steal her breath, not at her appearance, but as if he were trying to read whether she was the person he was desperately searching for. Someone who could stay awake with him through the longest nights. When their eyes met again, slower, deeper, more honest than either expected, Penelope felt a subtle shift in the air, like an invisible soft thread quietly connecting them, light enough not to scare either of them, yet real enough to make her heart stumble. On the other side of the table, in those steel blue eyes worn down by years of sleeplessness, Jackson too seemed to see something he hadn't dared hope for in a long time. Someone stepping into his life at the exact moment he hit rock bottom, carrying a warmth that pushed the darkness around him back just a little. In the nearly empty bar at midnight, with the guitar's low notes humming like a whisper of the American West, they stood there, two people who had endured too many fractures, and realized that this moment, small and wordless as it was, felt very much like a beginning fate had quietly arranged long ago. Whitetail Ranch had long been the pride of Colorado, an expansive horse farm stretching beneath rolling foothills, where powerful quarter horses and strikingly colorful paint horses galloped across fields that seemed endless. And the one who kept this place running like a perfectly ordered little world was Jackson Silver, 32 years old, tall, strong, carrying the calm presence of a man who has known responsibility for far too long. He walked the ranch with a confidence everyone assumed was natural, but the truth was that confidence had been built, layer by layer, over a nameless pain that began the night his mother died. From that moment on, darkness was no longer a time for rest. It became a land filled with echoes of memories, a place where Jackson couldn't close his eyes without feeling like everything around him might disappear again. He didn't need an alarm clock. His heart jolted him awake at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m., every night, every week, every month, for 5 long years. And each time he woke like that, he would throw on a jacket, walk to the stable alone, and check every horse, every stall door, every little sound, as if, by guarding everything well enough, the loss from that day wouldn't repeat itself. Even when the night was calm, even when the stable was perfectly still, Jackson still felt as though something threatening was lurking in the dark. Chronic insomnia left a quiet exhaustion in his eyes, faint shadows beneath them, slightly swollen eyelids, and the cold blue-gray gaze that sometimes seemed clouded with frost. Evan, his younger brother, saw all of it, but Jackson always said, "I'm fine," a phrase so worn out that Evan could no longer believe it. Eventually, Evan forced him to see a doctor. And in that small clinic on the edge of town, under the soft white glow of fluorescent light, Jackson heard the words that would change the path of his life. Their family doctor, a middle-aged man with a low voice and patient eyes, set his pen down and studied Jackson for a long moment before speaking. "Jack, you're not dealing with insomnia just because of stress. The problem is that you don't allow your body to rest at night. Every time you wake up and rush to the stable to check on everything, you're training your brain to believe nighttime is something to be on guard against." Jackson stayed silent, hands tightening slightly, but he didn't argue. The doctor continued, gentle but firm. "Your body is operating in survival mode. You think you're staying in control, but what you're actually doing is reinforcing fear. If you keep handling the nights this way, the insomnia will never end." Jackson exhaled slowly, as if those words hit a point he had avoided for years. "At night you need peace," the doctor said. "You need to let yourself believe you're safe, even for just a few hours. Rest is something you must learn again." Then the man added, practical and medical without any sugarcoating, "If you had someone to watch the stable at night, someone you trust who understands horses, your body would begin relearning how to relax." That was the only reason Jackson posted the job notice on the board. Not because he lacked staff. His ranch had plenty of workers day and night. He just needed someone who could make him believe he could close his eyes for a few hours without disaster striking. But he turned down almost every applicant. Some were afraid of the dark. Others didn't understand horses. A few talked too much, and others looked like they'd sprint away the moment a breeze howled. And to work the night shift at Whitetail Ranch, Jackson needed someone with a steady enough heart to stand in the stable when the rest of the world was drowning in silence. Then Penelope stepped into the bar that night. The way she looked around wasn't timid. It was the look of someone who had lived among howling winds and nighttime fields. When she sat down, her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was surprisingly calm. And when he asked the first question, "Do you truly love horses?" She didn't answer with poetic lines or long explanations. She said something so simple it knocked his heartbeat off rhythm. I learned to read a horse's ears before I learned to read a book. He tested her with a photo of a mare standing in a stall, a small challenge no applicant had ever passed. Penelope barely glanced before saying, ears pinned forward like that. She spooked, but not panicked. Her tone was soft, steady, as natural as breathing. And in that moment, Jackson knew exactly what he didn't dare admit out loud. She understood horses, and more importantly, she understood restless souls. Close to 1 a.m., Jackson's pickup truck turned onto the road leading to Whitetail Ranch, and Penelope, wrapped in a thin, faded jacket worn out by too many miles, could only hold her breath, not out of fear. But because the sight unfolding before her looked like a scene from a movie she once believed she would never step into. A row of warm yellow lights lined the tall black pines, the night wind slipping through the branches with a low, steady sound, like the heartbeat of a place that was always awake in peaceful silence. Small, flickering dots in the distance, perhaps lights from the horse barns, made the view feel both unfamiliar and unexpectedly comforting. She didn't know why, but in that moment, her chest loosened after months of feeling tied up by invisible ropes. Welcome to Whitetail Ranch, Jackson said, his warm, low voice cutting through the cold air, as if he, too, sensed that tonight felt different from every night in the last 5 years. The truck stopped in front of the main stable. Compared to the small sheds she and her father had built from old wood back in Pennsylvania, this place resembled a high-end equine care center, spacious, well-maintained, and so spotless that the smell of fresh straw mixed with the comforting warmth of carefully treated timber. Penelope pulled her zipper up, her hands trembling slightly from the cold, from exhaustion, and from the quiet feeling of, I've arrived, that she didn't dare put into words. Jackson pushed open the stable door, and warm golden light spilled out, carrying a heat that nearly made her cry with relief. Inside were 20 horses, black, brown, gray, and a few paints with beautifully modeled coats, standing in wide stalls with insulated roofing and thermal cameras in every corner. Everything was so organized that Penelope felt as though she had stepped into a modern hospital for horses rather than a regular stable. You can walk around, Jackson said, his hand lingering on the button of his coat as if making sure it wouldn't fall off her in the wind. Most of them are gentle, but a few have moods. Penelope smiled. Moody horses are kind of my specialty. He let out a soft laugh, a rare sound, hoarse and warm, the kind of sound that made her hide her slightly trembling hands in her pockets. But a small noise from a mare made both of them turn. The caramel-colored horse in stall number 6 was startled, breathing quickly, stomping its hooves as if something in the night had spooked it. Before Jackson could step forward, Penelope moved. No words and no rush. She simply reached out her hand, palm open, moving with the calmness of someone who had spent her childhood learning how to breathe in rhythm with horses. The mare hesitated, ears flicking, but when Penelope's breath reached its muzzle, the horse visibly softened, its breathing slowing, its head lowering slightly as if exhaling in relief. Jackson stood beside her, eyes widened with what could only be described as absolute astonishment. How did you do that? His voice wasn't loud, more like the wind brushing against wood, but it held curiosity and something that felt like hope. Penelope smiled, gently stroking the mare's nose. I grew up with them. Back in Pennsylvania, my dad said I could read horses before I could read words. Jackson's expression shifted completely, no longer assessing her skills. No skepticism, no test. Recognition. Recognition that she wasn't the person he hired. She was the person he needed. He remained still for a moment longer than necessary, long enough for her to feel his gaze following every movement she made. But it wasn't the staring of a man in a bar. It was the look of someone too tired to trust anyone, who had, for the first time in years, found something that made him want to pause and breathe. Penelope, he said, his voice low and soft, so gentle she almost didn't realize he was speaking. Let me take you to your cabin. Tonight, you should rest. She turned and met his steel blue eyes carrying restraint and years of layered exhaustion, but also the eyes of a man seeing a small light in a room he thought would remain dark forever. Penelope nodded. Yes, I think I found the right place. Jackson held the stable door for her and walked beside her along the gravel path toward the row of small cabins. The cold wind brushed her cheeks, but under the warm yellow lights, under the peaceful silence of the ranch at night, for the first time in months, Penelope felt she was no longer drifting. Whitetail Ranch and the quiet man walking beside her were becoming an anchor she had never dared to believe she would have. Penelope's first night at Whitetail Ranch didn't begin with fear, but with a feeling she couldn't quite name, as if the cold Colorado air pressed against her skin, yet couldn't make her tremble the way the strange calm blooming in her chest could. The small cabin was warm, with wooden walls and a bed by a window facing the pines outside, but she had no intention of sleeping. Her job was to stay awake. Her job was to stay close to the creatures whose eyes held a sincerity humans too often lacked. She shrugged on her jacket, grabbed her clipboard, and walked out to the stable under the silver moonlight. 25 minutes had passed since her shift began, and steadying her own breathing in the dark was part of the job. At the stable desk, the thermal camera monitors displayed the horses as bright shapes. The bellies of the pregnant mares glowed hotter, and the restless ones revealed their wakefulness in every flicker of movement. She turned her chair, scribbling on her clipboard with the precision of someone who grew up in a simple family stable. 12:30 a.m. Willow restless. 12:35 a.m. Marigold, pacing but calm. 12:40 a.m. Coco, normal breathing. She stood and began her rounds. Around 1 a.m., the stable fell into complete silence, a silence so deep a person could hear their own heartbeat. But Penelope didn't feel alone. If anything, she felt like she belonged. At about 1:15, faint footsteps sounded near the stable door. Not hooves, not wind. Boots. Familiar ones. Jackson walked in, hands buried in the pockets of his hoodie, hair slightly messy, as if he'd only managed a few minutes of sleep before his mind snapped him awake with its usual alertness. His shadow stretched long on the stable floor, broad and strong, but it carried a kind of quiet vulnerability no one would ever guess from his exterior. Couldn't sleep? Penelope asked softly. Stable nights were like a church, where every sound owed respect to the resting souls inside. Jackson shrugged, letting out a long breath. Tried, but my brain keeps flipping the light switch. He said it with a thin, paper-like smile. The kind of smile from someone too used to exhaustion to call it by name, still polite enough to hide it behind humor. So you came down here to, help me, she asked, half teasing, half sincere. Not exactly help, he replied, blue-gray eyes dimming a little. It's just, if you're here, the stable is safe. And if the stable is safe, maybe tonight I'll try sleeping again. Penelope didn't know what to say to a truth so gently spoken, yet so bare. A strong, capable, responsible man, unable to sleep unless he was certain everything was being guarded for him. By someone he trusted, by someone who, for some reason, was her. The realization softened something inside her like wax beneath warmth. Then just sit, she murmured. I'll do my job. You just breathe. Jackson looked at her a little longer than necessary, not with the cold gaze he had when they first met, but warmer, as if a small door inside him had quietly cracked open. 1:40 a.m. A sharp, panicked breath sounded from stall 12. Penelope spun around instantly. A pregnant mare, Stella, was circling repeatedly, pawing the ground, breathing fast. Penelope rushed forward so quickly that Jackson had to jog to keep up. Careful, he cautioned on reflex, but she was already at the stall, raising her hand, palm open toward the distressed mare. Hey, girl. Hey, I'm here. Easy. Just breathe with me. Her voice was velvet, steady, rhythmic, the kind of trust horses sense long before they understand words. Stella flared her nostrils, eyes darting. But then, slowly, surely, her breathing eased. Penelope gently touched her neck, stroking with the natural precision of someone born to this work. Jackson could only stand there, heart pounding for reasons he didn't understand. She close to her due date? Jackson asked, voice low with concern. A few weeks to go, Penelope answered, eyes still on Stella. But stress at this stage isn't great. She checked Stella's legs, belly, and reflexes, then concluded, no contractions, no early labor, just fear. Might have been a loud noise or strong wind. Jackson swallowed, part worry, part something else swelling unexpectedly. He'd seen many people care for horses, hired and fired, observed numerous skills. But no one had ever made the stable look safer the way Penelope did. She stood beside Stella, the stable lights turning her honey-brown hair into a soft halo. Her face was focused, calm, and in her eyes was something he couldn't look away from. Something like light, something a wanderer in darkness would hope for but never dare expect. Once Stella settled fully, Penelope stepped back and exhaled. She just needed someone beside her. Jackson began, then paused, uncertain how to say what pressed against his chest. So instead, he breathed out slowly and said the truest thing he could. Do you know, I can't remember the last time the stable felt this peaceful at night. Penelope turned to him. She didn't speak, but her expression said it all. I understand. And in that brief, quiet moment, amid the scent of hay, the sound of horses breathing, and warm light slipping through wooden slats, Jackson Silver realized something he'd never once considered. For the first time in 5 years, he wasn't afraid of the dark, because she was standing there. 3 weeks passed like Colorado's cold breeze, quick, crisp, and carrying the feeling of being renewed in ways one never expects. For Penelope, that time felt like a healing treatment she didn't recognize until one afternoon when she found herself standing in the ranch yard and realizing she was smiling. Not pretending, not to hide exhaustion, but a real smile, born from the feeling of being alive again. During the day, after a few hours of sleep, she joined the stable crew brushing the paint horses, relearning how to wrap their legs, and laughing with everyone when the pony whiskey stole cowboy hats and ran across the yard like it was his life's calling. Sometimes Evan, Jackson's younger brother, would take her riding on Maverick, the most beautiful horse on the ranch, and as she galloped across open fields with the wind slapping her cheeks, Penelope felt her heart grow lighter bit by bit. At night, she returned to her role as late shift watch, checking the thermal cameras, making rounds through the stable, documenting the breathing and behavior of the pregnant mares Jackson sometimes dropped by, but only once or twice a week, not to supervise her, but because some nights he simply couldn't sleep. Still, he never stayed long, and each time he left, he carried something intangible with him. Like the darkness was less threatening when he knew someone was there. Then came a night like any other. Yet it became the night that brought them closer. 4:50 a.m. The stable was so quiet she could hear the wind slipping through the wooden door. Penelope sat in the folding chair at the monitoring desk, her eyelids drifting after a long night, when those familiar footsteps echoed again, not rushed, not loud, as though the boot's owner wasn't even sure why he came, only that his feet brought him here. Jackson stepped into the warm glow of the lights, gray hoodie, hair damp as if he'd splashed water on his face to wake himself. He looked at her, not smiling, but with less of that constant exhaustion weighing down his eyes. You're still up? He asked quietly. Penelope tipped her chin toward the clipboard. Haven't finished the last round of notes. Jackson nodded, then, like an unspoken habit, set a thermos of coffee on the table. It's a bit strong, but I think you'll like it that way. She laughed. I like coffee as long as it's hot. They sat on the wooden steps outside the stable. The sky was still dark, but a faint pink glow had begun to spread along the horizon, mixing with milky fog. The smell of wet grass, wood, and hot coffee blended into something that made people believe they could start over. For a long moment, they just sat, quiet but not uncomfortable. Then Jackson broke the silence, voice low and slow. You've gotten used to this place, haven't you? Penelope looked down at her cup, blowing gently. I think, for the first time in a year, I don't feel like I'm being pushed out of somewhere. Jackson tilted his head. What do you mean? In New York, she said, smiling faintly at herself. Everything was so fast I felt like I was always falling behind. I lost my job, my apartment, and a relationship that was never healthy to begin with. I just slipped through the cracks. But here, things slow down. I can breathe. Her final words were soft, but Jackson heard each one clearly. He rolled his cup between his palms, looking out toward the hills. Me too. Penelope glanced over. You slipped through the cracks too? He gave a small laugh, one that made her heart skip. Not slipped, he said, more like stuck. She stayed quiet, not because she lacked things to say, but because she wanted to give him space. After Mom died, Jackson continued, night became a door that would never close. I'd wake up, check on things, terrified I'd miss something, even when I didn't know what I was looking for. His voice wasn't shaky, wasn't tight, just honest. And that honesty hit her with gentle force. But these few weeks, he said slowly, the nights aren't as scary. Penelope turned to him, eyes soft, deep. Because someone's watching the stable? She teased lightly. No, Jackson replied immediately. And then, realizing he answered too fast, he chuckled and nodded once. Well, partly, yes. But actually, he hesitated, debating the confession. I slept for about an hour and a half straight last week. Penelope nearly dropped her cup. Seriously? Yeah. His breath left him in a mix of wonder and pride. I think it's because I know someone's out there, someone who knows what to do. Her heart softened a beat, not from romance, but from sincerity. After a moment, she shared, when I was little, every morning I'd wake up to Dad talking to the horses. He always said they know when people are scared, when they're sad, when they're lonely, I guess sometimes. We need someone who can read us like that too. Jackson looked at her for a long time, long enough for dawn to sweep his eyes into the softest shade of pale blue she had ever seen. So you can read me? He asked, voice barely louder than the breeze. Penelope smiled. A little. And in that tiny moment, when the sky turned pink, when coffee steam hung in the quiet air between them, when silence shifted from heavy to comforting, something changed. Not love, not yet, but understanding. A first piece of trust falls perfectly into place, and as the sun rose, casting its first golden light over Whitetail's fields, Penelope realized she no longer felt stuck, no longer felt like a lost wanderer, and Jackson Silver was no longer a shadow, but something warmer, gentler, a very small beginning, but a beginning they both needed. More than 3 weeks since the day Penelope arrived at Whitetail Ranch, life had grown much softer. Soft enough that on a late weekend afternoon, clear sky, gentle breeze, horses grazing lazily, Jackson stood in front of the stable for a long moment, hands in the pockets of his jeans, awkward in a way ranchmen who were tough as steel would never admit. Finally he spoke, not looking at her to spare himself the embarrassment. Penelope, are you busy tonight? She was fastening the bridle on little Molly and looked up. No. Why? Jackson cleared his throat. I thought that if you wanted to, you could have dinner at the big house. Penelope froze for exactly 2 seconds. Her heart skipped in a strange way. Not flustered, but warm. I can, she said, her voice calmer than what she felt rising in her chest. 7 o'clock, Jackson replied, trying to keep his tone casual, as if this were normal for him. But the way he turned away too quickly to hide his awkwardness gave him away completely. Penelope spent over an hour getting ready, not because she wanted to impress him, but because it had been a long time since she'd been invited to dinner in a big house, and her heart felt just a bit fluttery. In the end, she chose a simple, light blue knee-length dress with soft fabric and a slightly square neckline. No heavy makeup, just a loose bun and a touch of lipstick. When she stepped onto the wooden porch of the big house, Jackson opened the door. And in that exact moment, he froze. No words and no movement, just staring at her as if the Colorado sunset had been poured directly over her. Penelope smiled softly, a little shy. I came on time, right? Jackson blinked once, exhaling as if he had just remembered to breathe. Yeah, you look amazing. She blushed. He panicked a bit because he had said the truth too bluntly. They both stood there like two high school students until, all right, a comedic voice echoed from the end of the hallway. Evan Silver, Jackson's younger brother, appeared with a grin bright enough to set off fireworks. I was here for 10 seconds, and the chemistry is already about to explode. Good Lord, you two. Please come inside before I pass out from all the cheesiness. Jackson smacked Evan's shoulder, but his eyes still flicked to Penelope a few more times, as if he couldn't quite believe she was really standing there. The dining room of the big house was warm and spacious, with dark wooden walls, soft yellow lighting, and a table set for three. Dinner was beef stew, which Evan proudly claimed was the best in Colorado unless you count the moms in town. The atmosphere was much more relaxed than Penelope expected. Evan talked a lot, Jackson talked little, and she didn't know when she started laughing so much. Laughing at Evan's ridiculous yet strangely charming jokes. Laughing because Jackson occasionally glanced at her with eyes that held unmistakable concern. So, ranch life treating you well? Evan asked, leaning on the table. I like it, Penelope replied. A lot calmer than the past few months. Everyone here is very kind. Jackson took a sip of wine, his voice low. You're doing very well. The horses like you. Penelope lowered her head slightly, smiling. I like them too. Their eyes met, lightly but persistently. Evan, sitting across from them, witnessed the entire scene. He raised an eyebrow, took a bite of bread, and whispered, Well, that's new. Jackson nudged his brother's leg under the table. Evan laughed even louder. Dinner continued in a strangely warm way. At one point, Penelope told the story of whiskey stepping on her boot, and Evan laughed so hard he nearly choked. Jackson tried to stay serious, but the corners of his lips curved just slightly. Another moment, Evan told the story of Jackson falling off a horse at 15 because he wanted to be the coolest cowboy in the West, and Penelope had to turn away to stop herself from bursting into laughter. Jackson only sighed. I knew inviting you to dinner while Evan was around was a mistake. A brilliant decision, Evan replied. I am the official catalyst of this dinner. Penelope laughed. Jackson laughed too. And if anyone had been watching from the outside, they would say his smile wasn't his usual smile. It was lighter, softer, as if her presence loosened something inside him. After dinner, Evan made an excuse about calling my girlfriend and disappeared faster than a shooting star, leaving the two of them standing in the long hallway near the front door. They didn't speak for a moment. The air was warm. The yellow lights cast long, streaky shadows across the wooden floor, and in that quiet space, the distance between them was so small that Penelope could hear Jackson's slow breathing. Thank you for coming, he said at last. His voice was low, sincere, soft enough that her heart almost slipped a beat. Penelope smiled. Thank you for inviting me. He opened the door for her, but before she stepped out, their eyes accidentally met again. Longer, deeper, quieter, as if something had just taken root. Something they both felt, but neither said aloud. And Jackson, who never spoke too much, murmured a single sentence as gentle as the wind. You make this house brighter. Penelope stopped for a heartbeat, then stepped out. The night was cold, but her chest was so warm she wasn't sure she could feel the cold anymore. The door closed softly behind her, and inside the big house, Jackson stood alone, hand resting on the doorknob, his heart beating to a rhythm he had forgotten for years, the rhythm of hope. Night fell over Whitetail Ranch in a deep shade of violet, the kind of darkness thick enough to swallow the last fragments of daylight. Long gusts of wind carried the scent of rain, threading through every crack of the stable. Yet in the late winter chill, Penelope felt every small shift of the horses through the thermal camera screens. After 3 weeks on the job, she was familiar with how those glowing shapes moved like living streaks of fire. And because she was familiar, she noticed instantly when something changed in stall 12. Stella, the largest pregnant mare on the ranch, was going into labor, and it was not an easy one. Her body reacted faster than her mind. Penelope shot up from her chair, gripping the clipboard as she hurried down the dark stable aisle, boots thudding rapidly against the wood. As she approached, she could already hear Stella's harsh breathing, the frantic pacing of hooves scraping across straw. A spark of adrenaline shot straight up her spine. The stall door creaked softly when she pushed it open. Stella stood trembling, sweat beading along her neck, eyes wide with pain, leaning forward as if searching for a place to brace herself in a world that refused to hold her still. Penelope pressed a hand to the mare's neck, her voice low and steady, using the tone that always seemed to reach through fear. "It's okay, girl. I'm right here, all right? Breathe with me." She hadn't even finished the sentence when hurried footsteps echoed from the stable entrance, urgent but controlled. Jackson. He wasn't wearing his usual ranch coat, only a worn gray hoodie he'd clearly thrown on in a rush. His hair was tousled as though he'd run out without checking a mirror. And in his face, Penelope caught something she rarely saw in grown men. Real fear. "Stella," she started. His voice was rough, not from the cold, but from dread. Penelope nodded quickly. "You got here just in time, but the foal's position isn't ideal." Jackson's expression changed instantly, not panicked, but tight enough that she noticed the subtle tremble of the hand he balled into a fist. "I'll call Evan." "No," Penelope said, gently touching his wrist, just enough pressure to make him look at her. "I just need you here with me. That's enough." Such a small sentence, but something in it made Jackson straighten, his shoulders lifting like she had just placed trust in his hands, something heavy and precious. "Okay," he said quietly. "Tell me what you need." The wind hammered the roof in uneven waves, as though someone outside was knocking to be let in. But inside the stall, the world narrowed to 3 beating hearts, a mare fighting for life, a man fighting his fear, and a woman stepping fully into the instincts she had been born with. Penelope pulled on gloves and moved into position, her tone steady as the strong, sure heartbeat of someone who had lived half her childhood inside a stable. "She's stressed. I need you on this side. Keep her from leaning too hard. Support her. Don't push." Jackson obeyed immediately, faster and calmer than any assistant she had ever worked with. His hand found the right place on Stella's flank, right pressure, right angle, absolutely no hesitation. He didn't ask questions. He looked only to Penelope, waiting for the next instruction. She checked the foal's orientation, her fingers detecting subtle angles and movement. Her brow furrowed. "One shoulder is slightly turned. We'll need to realign." Jackson glanced at her, voice dropping under the weight of worry he refused to show. "Is it dangerous?" "Not if we do it right," she replied, eyes focused. "But it'll hurt her. Just stay with her. Don't let her fall." "I'm here," he said instantly, like a vow spoken from his bones. A harsh cry tore from Stella's throat, and the sound made Penelope's stomach twist. But she didn't pause. She worked carefully, adjusting bit by bit, hands steady even though the air around them felt tight with tension. Then a surge, a rupture of movement. Stella's whole body strained, a heavy groan shaking through her. Penelope held her ground. Jackson held Stella upright. And suddenly a slick, warm weight slipped into Penelope's hands. A fragile breath. So faint, but real. The foal was born. For one suspended moment, the stable seemed to break open in silence. Nothing existed except the exchange of breath and life between Earth and every soul in this room. Penelope swiftly cleared the foal's nose and stimulated its breathing. Stella stretched her neck toward her baby, licking the newborn with a primal, sacred urgency that melted the tension in Penelope's chest like ice under sunlight. Jackson stood frozen, eyes wide, breathing as if he'd sprinted a mile. His gaze flickered between the foal and Penelope, and back again, as though unsure which miracle to focus on first. When the foal wriggled, letting out a tiny sound as it sought its mother, Jackson released a breath he'd probably been holding for weeks. "You did it," he murmured, his voice not that of the composed ranch owner, but of a boy who had just witnessed magic after a long winter. "Penelope, my God, you actually did it." Penelope didn't have time to smile before Jackson pulled her into a hug. Not because he needed support to stand, not out of polite gratitude, but because every part of him had just been freed from a fear that had a name, and many that didn't. His reflex was to hold on to the first source of light he'd seen in years. She froze for a heartbeat. Then her arms wrapped around him. Pure instinct. Their breaths mixed in the air, heavy with straw and the scent of new life. The hug lasted too long to be accidental. Longer than a second. Longer than a heartbeat. Longer than something casual. Long enough for both to realize they had crossed a line no one dared name. And when Jackson slowly stepped back, his hands still remained on her upper arms, reluctant to break the connection. You, he began, but the words fell apart because her eyes were on him in a way that made language feel clumsy. Penelope inhaled softly, her voice gentle as the last whisper of a fading storm. You okay? Jackson swallowed, blue-gray eyes shimmering under the stable lights like storm water caught by moonlight. Not exactly, he admitted, but I feel calmer for the first time in a long time. Penelope didn't answer with words. She placed her hand on his chest, right over the heart that had been pounding wildly from fear. A simple gesture, soft but enough to make Jackson shut his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, they were still standing close enough that their breath intertwined. So close it felt like the foal wasn't the only new thing birthed tonight. Something else had been born too gentler, warmer, beautiful in a way that terrified them both. Something neither dared say aloud, something neither stepped away from. And in the quiet stable, beneath the howling wind and the newest heartbeat in the world, neither of them let go. The night after the difficult foaling, when everything had finally calmed, when Stella and the newborn foal were lying together in the straw with steady breaths, Penelope stepped out of the stable to get a bit of fresh air. Colorado at the end of September had a very specific kind of cold, not the biting winter cold of New York, but a gentle chill like someone lightly brushing their fingertips against the back of your neck. Just enough to make you honest about feelings you had been trying to keep hidden. Jackson's footsteps appeared behind her, steady but slow, as though he was walking through his own long day rather than across the ground. He stopped beside her, leaned against the old wooden railing, and took a long breath, as if his body was finally allowed to relax after hours wound tight like a drawn bowstring. Neither of them spoke for the first few seconds. The sky above stretched with glittering stars, and the silver moonlight washed over the ranch, making everything look as if it were being held inside a giant glass jar. Still, clear, no longer like the place where someone could spend years fighting insomnia and fear. It was Jackson who broke the silence. His voice was low, hoarse, and slightly unsure, as if the words had lived inside him for a long time, but never found a way out. I don't sleep, he said, eyes fixed on the dark mountain silhouette. Not really, not in 5 years. Penelope turned toward him. She wasn't surprised, not completely. She had sensed something from the very beginning, the quiet exhaustion, the alertness that never left his eyes, the way he could distinguish the footsteps of each horse from just a shift in the night. But hearing him say it aloud was something else. He continued without waiting for her to ask. The night my mom died, I was right in the next room. His hand tightened around the wooden rail, his knuckles stark white. I thought if I stayed awake a little longer, kept watch a little more, I could stop it from happening, but I couldn't. His voice cracked mid-sentence, not the kind that leads to sobbing, but the kind that comes from someone who has held everything in too long, each word carrying the weight of 5 years of self-blame. Penelope didn't rush to comfort him. She understood that kind of pain, the kind that never lives alone, that always tries to plant its roots in every empty space left inside a person. Jackson exhaled heavily, each breath scraping against an old wound. Since that night, he said slowly, I wake up whenever the wind changes direction, when the door creaks, when the barn shifts even a little, I keep thinking, if I don't watch everything, something will take another person away. A cold breeze passed by, lifting Penelope's bangs. She stepped one small pace closer, not enough to crowd him, but enough that her presence warmed a corner of his world. Jackson, she said softly, you couldn't save your mother because it wasn't your fault, and now you can't save everything just by not sleeping. He closed his eyes slowly, like fatigue was finally rising from somewhere deep. Fatigue of a man who had been running for years only to stay in place. She gently placed her hand over his, her palm warm and real, and Jackson opened his eyes instantly, as if that warmth had pierced not only skin, but the ice he had buried under the grief of losing his mother. Penelope continued, her voice like a cup of hot cocoa at 4 a.m., sweet, soothing, and making the listener feel they deserve to stay in this world. You don't have to hold this ranch on your own anymore. If a horse is stressed, I'm there. If the cameras show something strange, I'm there. If the night gets so quiet it scares you, I'm still there. Jackson looked at her saying nothing, but his eyes, God. They were the eyes of a man who had not allowed himself to lean on anyone for far too long and was now, for the first time, finding someone who could carry a piece of his heaviness without making him feel weak. He spoke softly, almost only loud enough for the two of them to hear. I don't know why you came to Whitetail Ranch this season, but I think I've been waiting for you longer than you think. Penelope felt her chest warm, not with the sharp, dramatic kind of emotion from romance movies, but with a gentle warmth so peaceful she wanted to exhale. She answered with a small smile, not a practiced one to charm, not one meant to impress, but the smile of someone who had carried her own sorrow too far and finally found a place that wasn't home, but something like a timely pause. Maybe, she said softly as mist. You don't have to fight the night anymore, Jackson. Not when you're not in it alone. And in that moment, neither of them touched each other further. There was no embrace or heated kiss, yet the intimacy was deeper than anything they had ever done, because this was the first time Jackson truly saw her. Not as the night shift worker, not as the woman skilled with horses, but as the first person in years who made the darkness inside him less frightening. Inside the stable, Stella breathed more evenly, and the newborn foal snorted softly as if in quiet celebration. And outside, in the cold Colorado night, two people who once thought they had broken in places no one could ever reach, found a place to begin healing. Together, even if neither of them said it out loud. October in Colorado always carried the kind of atmosphere that made people smile a little easier. A sky clear as glass, a breeze scented with pine and pumpkin, and the hills turning a vibrant burnt gold, as if someone had brushed the whole world with warm paint. Tonight, the town of Meadowbank was hosting its fall festival, the biggest celebration of the year, where both ranch chores and lingering sorrows could be left behind at the wooden gate of the town square. Standing in front of the mirror in her small cabin, Penelope exhaled one long, nervous breath. She had lived at Whitetail Ranch nearly 2 months. She was used to sunrises over the stable roof, used to the scent of alfalfa, used to Jackson showing up at 2 a.m. some nights just to ensure she wasn't cold. But going to the fall festival with him was something else entirely. She chose a simple cream knit dress, layered with an old denim jacket, and tied her hair in a loose ponytail. Nothing fancy, nothing bold, yet when she stepped outside, she still startled slightly at the sight of Jackson leaning casually by the ranch truck, looking at her in a way that made her heartbeat lose its sense of rhythm. He wore a light brown jacket over a gray tee, hair slightly tousled as if he'd run his fingers through it more than once. The soft amber glow from the cabin porch light struck his jaw just right, sharpening the strong lines of his face. Ready? He asked, voice low and steady, like night wind that somehow made her chest tighten. Yes, Penelope answered, though her pulse was anything but composed as she approached him. The drive into town took only 15 minutes, but 15 minutes filled with a strangely tender silence. Not awkward, just warm, the kind of silence where the simple awareness of each other made the country music on the radio sound sweeter and made every heartbeat seem louder. Meadowbank Square glittered beneath hundreds of string lights draped over cozy vendor stalls. Caramel apples, roasted pumpkin slices, handcrafted leather goods, even an outdoor movie corner playing classic American fall films. Children darted around in clusters, laughing with cotton candy in hand. Pumpkin spice, cinnamon apples, popcorn, hot coffee, all of it blended into a scent that felt unmistakably like a festival. Penelope breathed in deep. And for the first time in years, she felt like she was standing exactly where her heart belonged. Jackson slowed his pace to walk right beside her, not touching, not rushing, but close enough that she could hear his soft breaths in the crisp night. In Meadowbank, This is the night that helps everyone survive the long winter ahead, Jackson said, eyes roaming the twinkling lights, reflecting the dark Colorado sky. You like it? Penelope asked. He gave a small, rare smile. It's been 5 years since I really showed up. She understood instantly. For 5 years, every night had been a battlefield for him. Tonight was an exception. They tried a ring toss game, the kind no one ever actually wins, but everyone plays anyway, because it feels like childhood. Penelope missed 3 throws in a row, laughing so hard she bent double each time. Jackson crossed his arms, amusement lighting his face. You know you just threw that last one completely off the table, right? If you didn't tell me, I wouldn't feel nearly as embarrassed. He laughed, a real laugh, brightening his whole face like the lights above them. When his turn came, Jackson landed his ring on the bottle in one smooth motion. But Penelope barely noticed the throw. She noticed his hand brushing the back of hers as he passed her another ring. An accidental touch. But every vein beneath her skin lit up like string lights. She threw again, missed again. Absolutely nothing remarkable about it, except Jackson was close enough that when she turned, their jackets brushed. Her heart completely forgot its normal job. After losing spectacularly, they left the games and wandered past a stall selling hot apple cider. Penelope breathed deeply. It felt like the scent wrapped itself inside her rib cage and stayed there. Jackson offered her a cup. It's hot. Careful. She touched his hand when she took it. His warmth was so startling, she nearly forgot the cider required both hands. They strolled beneath maple-shaped lanterns. A couple walked by, hand in hand, giggling. Penelope's eyes lingered a moment before she looked back. Right as Jackson was already looking at her. Not a passing glance. Not accidental. Really looking. As if in the middle of a crowded festival, she was the only one he saw. I'm glad you're here, Pen, he said. Quiet, just for her. Simple words, short words, but heat rushed up her neck and into her ears like wildfire. She quickly turned to study a pumpkin stand. But Jackson stayed close. Close enough that every time their arms brushed, a tiny thrill shot through her. Oh no, she was going to blush through this entire festival. They reached the outdoor line dancing floor, country music twirling through the air. Jackson stood still for a moment, then offered his hand. Calm, certain, no hesitation. Want to try? Penelope gave him a breathless little laugh. I'm going to crush your toes. That's fine, Jackson said softly. Tonight I can handle anything. That line, she had absolutely no idea where to look. They joined the dancing crowd. Penelope was clumsy but thrilled. Jackson, warm and patient, guided her through each step. No tight embrace or bold touch. Just his hand finding the small of her back whenever she slipped a beat. Somehow, the gentlest touches were the ones that almost made her sigh out loud. As the festival began to wind down, the night breeze swept across the dangling lights, causing them to sway like tiny stars. On the walk back to the truck, Penelope held her empty cider cup a little too tightly, trying to hide the pounding inside her chest. Jackson opened the truck door for her, standing close enough that his breath mingled with hers in the cool air. He tilted his head, voice low and warm. If I remember anything about the fall festival this year, it'll be you. And just like that, Penelope knew she would never forget tonight. The festival night ended under the familiar Colorado moon, bright and clear but soft, like a layer of cream poured over the distant mountains and the dark meadows stretching beneath their feet. When Jackson suggested riding back to the ranch instead of driving, Penelope thought he was joking. But when she saw him lead Storm and Maple, two of the gentlest horses on the ranch, toward her, the look he gave her was a quiet invitation she couldn't refuse. They rode side by side on the dirt road leading back to Whitetail Ranch, the shadows of the two horses stretching long across the ground like two slow-moving puzzle pieces next to each other. No engine noise, no headlights, just the steady rhythm of hooves and the sound of wind brushing through pine needles, carrying a faint hint of caramel apple lingering from the festival. Penelope couldn't remember the last time she'd seen a sky with so many stars. Maybe when she was 12, lying on wet grass beside her family's barn, listening to the Pennsylvania wind sweep over the hills. But tonight was different. Tonight beside her was Jackson, the quiet, steady man whose steel blue eyes always held something fragile beneath the surface, something she couldn't stop wanting to understand. After a while, Jackson tilted his head slightly toward her. Not much, just enough for his voice to blend into the night breeze. "You cold?" A simple question, but the way he asked made it sound like he wanted to make sure not even a single strand of her hair suffered from the night wind. "I'm not cold," Penelope answered, though her chest warmed in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. When they reached the ranch, the warm yellow lights from the stable spilled out, illuminating them like a scene only the most beautiful nights of a lifetime could capture. Penelope slid off her horse first, but her feet barely touched the ground before Jackson's hand came to her waist. Not to claim, but to steady, to make sure she didn't stumble after the long ride. She turned back. He was standing close enough for her to see every faint stubble on his jaw, close enough that even his breath drifting through the night touched her lips like an unspoken whisper. "Careful," he murmured, his voice dropping so low it almost melted into the air. Penelope should have stepped back, should have wished him good night, should have kept a safe distance between a ranch worker and the ranch owner. But Jackson's eyes didn't let her. They weren't tense, not fearful, not shut the way they usually were. They were open, open just enough for her to see the deepest part he always hid. Jackson removed the reins, hung them on the wooden hook, then turned back to her. The space between them was only one breath. "Penelope." He said her name like it had just become part of his heartbeat. "I haven't slept well in a year." She looked up, her heart skipping, not because of the words, but because of the way he was looking at her, as if she were the only thing in all his winters he wasn't afraid of. He continued, his voice so beautiful it felt like the whole night quieted to listen. "But the nights feel easier since you came." Penelope felt her chest tighten in the gentlest way, not painful, not uncomfortable, but like a heart beginning to believe that what it felt was real. "Me too," she said, and it was completely true. His breath hitched for a second. Then he stepped closer, exactly half a step. She didn't look away. He didn't either. The silence lasted a few seconds, but felt like moments that could stay in memory for a lifetime. Then in the quiet of the stable, with soft golden light brushing against Penelope's hair, Jackson lifted his hand and gently touched her jawline. Not to pull her in, but to ask with a gesture, "May I?" Penelope tilted her face just slightly, enough for him to understand, and the first kiss touched down. Slow, very slow, so soft it felt like only breath, but deep enough to make her whole body dissolve into light. It wasn't a demanding kiss, not rushed, not meant to claim anything. It was simply a kiss that both had waited too long to share with the right person who could quiet their hearts. Jackson kissed her once, pulled back, then returned, this time deeper, more earnest, but still so gentle it made a shiver run down Penelope's spine with every beat. When they parted, his forehead rested against hers, their breaths mingling like two streams meeting in the night. "Good night, Pen," he whispered, his voice soft enough that she wished she could hold the words in her hands. That night, for the first time after a long, dragging year, Jackson Silver, the man used to jolting awake at every change in the wind, slept straight through until sunrise. And the reason wasn't that the ranch was quiet, it was the woman who had just placed her first kiss on him in the stable, a kiss that gave the shadows inside him somewhere to finally rest. The job offer found Penelope on a Colorado morning so peaceful, she almost didn't know where to put her feelings. When her phone buzzed lightly in her pocket and the screen lit up with an email from the Santa Fe Therapeutic Riding Center, her heart seemed to skip a beat, because this was exactly the kind of work she had once believed she would never have again after those hollow, unraveling months in New York. A full-time instructor position, steady pay, a professional environment, a sun-soaked artsy city, a wide-open road any 30-something would dream of walking down if they didn't have something or someone tying their heart to where they already were. But Whitetail Ranch was no longer just a place on a map. It was the warmth of fog-heavy mornings, the sound of horses breathing behind her when the sky turned dark, the soft honeyed glow spilling out from the stable doors when the world outside grew too loud. And, more than all of that, it was Jackson Silver, the man she had never expected would, in just a few weeks, become the axis around which every important question in her life now spun. Jackson knew about the email the moment Penelope stepped out of her cabin with that strange, weighted quiet wrapped around her. The kind of silence that only appears when a heart is being pulled in two directions and both of them matter. He didn't ask to see the message. He didn't press her for details. He didn't try to keep her with a selfish plea. He simply stood leaning against the stable door, one hand resting on the flank of a mare halfway through her breakfast, and spoke in a low, steady voice so controlled it hurt to listen to. "If it's a good opportunity," he said slowly, "you should take it." Then he walked away, leaving behind a silence so deep Penelope could hear the wind scraping along the tin roof. Night fell over the ranch with a heavy, suffocating stillness, as though someone had dragged a thick blanket across every rooftop, every fence line, every field. And as soon as the sky surrendered completely to darkness, Jackson's insomnia came back. Not the restless, half-waking kind that made him jerk awake at the smallest sound. Not the ingrained habit that had once driven him out to check the horses over and over again. This time, it arrived like the old shadow he had thought he'd outrun these past 2 months, returning with teeth sharper than ever now that his heart was staring down the possibility of loss all over again. He lay in bed with every muscle strung tight, breathing without really feeling the air fill his lungs. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Penelope packing up, walking down the drive, leaving Whitetail behind. The image was so vivid it felt less like a fear and more like a memory, except it hadn't happened. Not yet. He sat up, lay back down, got up again. He wandered to the kitchen and tried to make herbal tea, but his hands shook so hard that water sloshed over the rim of the mug and onto the counter. He stepped out onto the porch, staring at the dark outline of the stable as if it were the only place in the world that understood just how badly his chest ached. By the time the clock blinked 2 a.m., his feet had already carried him where they always did on the worst nights, to the stable, the one place that had held his sanity together during the darkest years. He stood there leaning into Storm's stall, palm pressed so hard to the wooden wall his knuckles turned white, eyes hollowed out, sleeplessness carved into every shadow of his face. Even his breath looked tired. On the third night like this, Evan found him, shoulders slumped, hoodie wrinkled, hair a mess as though Jackson had raked his hand through it 100 times just to have something to do with the nervous energy eating him alive. "You're not sleeping again, are you?" Evan asked, though he already knew. There was no need for an answer. Everything about Jackson's posture spoke for him. "Worse than 5 years ago," Evan finally muttered, standing beside him in the kind of silence that made strangers uneasy just by stepping into it. "Worse than after Mom died." Jackson said nothing for so long that Evan started to think he wouldn't answer at all. Then his voice broke the air, rough and strained, like old wood cracking under the weight of snow. "I don't know how to let the woman I love be free," he said quietly, "without feeling like I'm about to lose everything all over again." Evan's gaze softened, his eyes filled with a compassion he didn't dare voice. "You can't ask her to choose," he said gently, "if you're too afraid to choose yourself." Then Evan walked away, leaving Jackson alone with the horses, the night, and a fear expanding inside him like a bottomless pit. The week that followed stretched like a month, heavy and slow, each day adding another stone to the pile in Penelope's chest. She tried to think logically. Santa Fe was a golden opportunity, a new chapter, the sort of bright turning point people prayed for when their lives were stuck. It was the path she should have wanted. But Whitetail Ranch had become the place where her heart finally stopped running. Each morning, coffee facing the violet-tinted mountains, each afternoon leading horses back to their stalls, each night hearing Jackson's footsteps echo down to the stable, reminded her that life wasn't about choosing the best option on paper. It was about choosing the right one for your soul. And every night when she glanced toward Jackson's cabin and saw the light still on at 1, 2, 3 in the morning, hours when he should have been sleeping deeply after a first kiss so soft and perfect, it seemed to settle over the entire stable like a blessing. She knew the truth she had tried to avoid. His insomnia was back, because of her, because he was afraid of losing her. And that knowledge didn't feel like pressure. It felt like love tugging at the most tender part of her heart. On the seventh night, the wind carried the scent of dry pine needles, and the air had a sharper bite than usual. Penelope slipped into her coat and stood at her cabin door for a long, steady breath, before finally stepping out, her feet moving with a certainty her mind had been trying and failing to catch up to all week. By the time she reached the stable, her phone screen told her it was 2:03 a.m. A muted yellow light glowed from inside. She didn't need to look to know exactly where he was. The third stall on the left, the spot where he always stood when sleep abandoned him. The place he had clung to through grief and panic for years, and where he had spent the last 7 nights simply trying not to say her name out loud. She pushed the door open. Jackson turned. He looked at her like a man too exhausted to dare believe that she was really there. His eyes were red, his hair disheveled, his broad shoulders bowed under the weight of something heavy and invisible. One hand braced against the wooden stall wall, as though he needed its solidity to keep from collapsing. "Pen," he breathed. Her name left him like the exhale of someone who had finally reached shore after a storm. Penelope walked toward him, not rushing, not shaking, but no longer maintaining that careful, polite distance, because distance was exactly what had been tearing him apart. She stopped right in front of him and met his gaze, eyes the color of storm clouds holding both fear and a flicker of something like hope. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, "for a long time, Jackson, for a very long time." She placed her hand on his chest, right over the heart pounding hard and desperate beneath his hoodie. "And I finally realized that the future I want," her voice softened, steady and sure, "it has to be a future that feels like coming home." Jackson swallowed, his eyes closing for a flicker of a second as a tremor ran through him, as if he were so afraid of the answer that he could hardly bear to hear it spoken aloud. "And you, Jackson," she whispered, every word clear in the stillness, "you feel like home." In that moment, the stable lights seemed to burn a little brighter. His breath broke in a rush, and the fear that had gnawed at him for 7 endless nights simply dissolved, melting away like frost under the first touch of sun. He stepped closer. She did too. No one could say who moved first. All that mattered was that the space between them disappeared. Jackson wrapped his arms around her, not tight, not frantic, but deep and lingering, like a thank you, a release, and a confession all wrapped into one. Penelope slid her arms around his back and rested her forehead against his shoulder, holding on as if she'd finally found shelter after a long, bitter winter. And there, in the quiet stable that had once been the stage for his grief and endless sleepless nights, they chose each other. Not because fate demanded it, but because both of them finally understood that sometimes love is as simple and as brave as choosing the person who makes you stop being afraid of the dark. Harvest night had always been the biggest event of the year at Whitetail Ranch. A night when the barn was decorated with hundreds of string lights, bright pumpkins lined up in rows, warm golden hay bales neatly stacked in the corners, and country music filled the air like the very breath of this land. For a week, everyone on the ranch had been eagerly preparing, hanging lights, setting up tables, baking apple pies, roasting pumpkins, and laying Navajo-patterned rugs across the floor to carry the true spirit of a Western autumn. Penelope stepped into the barn just as the music shifted to a soft guitar melody, and instantly everyone paused for half a second before letting out little exclamations of delight, not because she wore elaborate makeup or a glittery party dress. Not at all. She had chosen a simple burgundy dress, gently fitted, soft like red wine swirling in a glass. Her hair tied in a low knot with a few curled strands falling around her neck. But that simplicity made her stand out in a way everyone felt. This was the woman Whitetail Ranch had been waiting for. And Jackson, standing in the corner of the barn talking to Evan, nearly dropped his cup of warm apple cider onto the wooden floor. His eyes locked onto her the moment she entered, and the expression on his face, dear God. Penelope had seen his gentle gaze before, the grateful one, the pained one he tried to hide, the tense one, and the brief happiness after their first kiss. But tonight was different, deep, full, wide open, like a cloudless sky. The look of a man who knew that what he was about to do would change the rest of his life. Penelope took a few steps, her heart beating in time with the music, but Jackson was already walking toward her, brushing past people without noticing. When he reached her, he extended his hand. "Dance with me?" His voice was low, beautiful, with a faint rasp of someone hiding an emotion much bigger than his composure allowed. She placed her hand into his, warm, steady, so gentle that every doubt that had ever lingered in her disappeared completely. Jackson led her to the center of the dance floor. Golden lights swayed above them. A breeze carried the scent of baked apples and cinnamon into the barn. He placed one hand on her back, held her hand with the other, and they began to sway in a slow dance, their steps weaving together as though they had practiced all their lives just to move perfectly on this night. Penelope rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, strong, round, honest, no longer rushed like the nights of his insomnia, but steady, calm, as if his body had finally found the rhythm of peace. After a long moment, Jackson bent down to whisper near her ear, his voice low, warm, and so sincere it made her entire body tremble softly. "Penelope, I stopped having sleepless nights when you arrived." One sentence, but it carried 5 years of darkness and 3 months of healing. He paused for just a beat, just one, like the sound of her heartbeat had caught his breath. Then he whispered again, slower, deeper, so soft it brushed the most fragile part of her. "Stay every night with me, for the rest of our lives." Penelope lifted her head, her eyes shimmering though she hadn't cried yet. She didn't need light to know what was in Jackson's eyes. Choice, promise, love, and gratitude for her arriving at the moment he needed someone most. The music still played softly. The ranch was still laughing and talking. Kids were running around the decorated barrels. Evan was in the corner, eating apple pie and observing like a self-appointed paparazzi. But for Jackson and Penelope, everything blurred. There was only them. Only the whisper flows between their breaths. And then under the shimmering lights of harvest night, Jackson released her hand, stepped back, his heartbeat pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, and he went down on one knee on the barn's wooden floor. The entire room seemed to inhale. Penelope lifted her hand to her mouth. Even the wind seemed to stop. Jackson looked up, his steel blue eyes so beautiful they made everything else fade. "Penelope O'Hara, stay. Stay on this ranch. Stay in my life. Stay in every night and every morning. Marry me." His voice trembled slightly, not out of fear she might refuse, but because his love for her was too full to fit inside a body that had spent years exhausted and was now coming back to life with every beat. Penelope couldn't speak. Her tears fell in a steady stream, not tears of pain, but the tears of someone who had finally found a safe harbor after a long journey of being lost. She nodded, a strong, beautiful, certain nod. The barn erupted in cheers. Evan yelled so loudly the horses outside probably heard it. "Finally!" The whole ranch burst into laughter and applause. Someone turned up the music. People started recording videos. Storm neighed in his stall as if he wanted to join the historical moment. Jackson stood up, wrapped Penelope in his arms, lifted her slightly off the ground, spinning her in the middle of the cheers, his face buried in her hair, silently thanking every winter that had led her to him exactly when he needed her. They married in spring, the season with the most foals, the greenest meadows, the clearest Colorado skies stretching all the way to the distant mountains. Penelope said goodbye to the night shift. A new worker was hired. Jackson no longer needed to get up in the middle of the night to check the stable. His heart had found a place to rest, and his body finally allowed itself to sleep deeply beside the woman who made the night no longer frightening. 10 years later, 2 children ran across the field behind the ranch, a curly-haired girl laughing like sunlight, a boy with steel blue eyes just like his father. Jackson stood behind the boy, hands steady on his back as the child learned to ride a horse for the first time, his eyes brighter than someone who had ever known darkness. Penelope stood near the fence, a cup of tea in hand, smiling at the three of them as if watching the most beautiful scene of her life. Whitetail Ranch was no longer just a workplace, a home, or a refuge. It was home, the place where 2 lost souls found each other, the place where the harvest wasn't only for the fields but for the heart, And every night, when Penelope tilted her head and asked, "Still afraid of the nights?" Jackson would always smile, pull her into his arms and say, "Not anymore. Not since you walked into my life." And the night would close in peace, just as he had promised on that harvest night long ago.